Welcome everybody, it's so nice to see so many people here. I'm Shaba Jaffa, I'm the Director of the Institute for Global Health, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Maryam Shalmanesh's inaugural lecture. So Maryam's an epidemiologist, she's a scientist, she's an honorary consultant in sexual health and HIV medicine. She's been with us since about 2002. She joined us as a research fellow and then worked her way up and got promoted to professor about 4 or 5 years ago. She's had a really exciting career. She's lived in Burma, lived in India, and then kind of now a third of her time lives in South Africa. In her work, she's leading a number of really important, really large-scale policy-relevant trials, implementation trials, which are really important in the field. Maryam is also a teacher. She's a teacher. She's designed, led 3 MSc programs. She's supervised numerous students and mentors and supports researchers both here at UCL and her African partners in South Africa, where she works. And she's universally liked by people that she mentors and people that she supervises. So she'll present today. I'm glad she's left her title on because I was trying to present that.
So thank you, Shaba, for a really lovely introduction, especially now I know that that's not something that's easy, so it's great. Thank you very much. I am sorry about that long title, and the lecture is probably, as Francis said, a tour de force, so bear with me. I've tried to pitch something for everyone, but I've probably got nothing for anyone. So what I would just sort of start with the problem statement of what I do, because that will explain a lot of where we got to. And so although we have very effective, cheap, safe biomedical tools, that means an HIV test, which is what we call, or Rachel here calls, a humble lateral flow test, which is like a COVID test, like a pregnancy test anyone can do, cheap as chips. This can then allow you to know whether you're negative, in which case you go on to HIV pre-exposure prophylaxis, which will keep you negative. Or if you're positive, you can go on to treatment, and that makes your viral load suppressed, and therefore you can't transmit. So we actually have the tools which would allow us to eliminate HIV. And yet, as of 2022, we still had 1.3 million new infections, and that's continuing. And so what we have is an individual level intervention that isn't having a population level effect. And so what I'm going to try and argue through this lecture is that tackling socioeconomic injustice and sexual health rights are integral to strengthening resilience against HIV. And without doing that bigger package, we are never going to tackle the HIV epidemic or any bloodborne virus for that matter. So I'm going to start with chapter 1, origins. In an era where democracy, freedom, and sexual rights are under attack, I dedicate this lecture really to all those people in my life, many of who are in this room today, who've taught me what women, life, and freedom, Zan Zindagi Azadi, in Farsi mean. I was born in Burton-upon-Trent and joined 2 years later by my beloved daughter, little sister, Narges. And you can see both of us on the bottom row next to the big panda. And on the top row are my parents, Joel and Mohsen, who we lived with. But we were surrounded, they were young, and we were surrounded by a youthful and glamorous family and friends, all excited by revolutions and telling me stories and letting my imagination run wild. So that is where I started. And I think Peter here knows a lot about my imagination. In 1974, we drove and camped our way from Bristol to Shiraz, where Mohsen, my dad, had been offered a post by Dr. Nasser at Shiraz University. It was on this exciting trip that I had my first Iranian fairy tale. So Mohsen and Masood said, Iran is a beautiful kingdom, but is governed by an evil king, the Shah. We were gently warned not to repeat anything bad that we hear at home about the Shah. This tyrannical ruler, otherwise the soldiers of the realm, otherwise known as the Savak, would come and throw us in deep, dark dungeons. Now, I was happily believed this story, as it really resonated with my imaginary stories, aged 6 and 7. But I also remember my glamorous feminist mother, Jale, was not as excited by this return. She was fearing a return to patriarchal society that she remembered leaving when she was 17, and losing all the freedoms that she enjoyed in Bristol. In actual fact, Shiraz of the 1970s was a paradise, as lovely, if not lovelier than Bristol, and my mum did really enjoy Shiraz of the 1970s. We lived in this lovely garden, Bagh Namozi, which means Garden of Namozi, which was the doctors and nurses compound, with my friend here, Omanes, here too. And we had so much freedom, and that allowed our imaginary worlds to flourish. We were indulged by all the people around us. My little sister indulged all my imaginary stories, but as did amazing friends, Amina that you see here, but others online, Zahra, Kamran, Mitra. And so we did have this really exciting time. And so we slid into revolution, with the optimism that was epitomized in our play, Shah and the People, but shattered shortly afterwards by the brutal clampdown that followed. So as a revolution is inaugural in itself, and so I've left you only with some books that I recommend you buy online, because they can describe it better than I can. But witnessing the Iranian Revolution, even the failure that it became, was my first lesson in power, in the power of collective action and solidarity. Seeing millions of people rise up against tyranny and the establishment of, which sort of spontaneously came out of our school and our neighborhood councils, really inspiring examples of grassroots democracy and collectivization in action. But also, the rapid collapse when we faced with the violence that was unleashed by the Islamic Republic was a second lesson in the unsustainability of these types of grassroots organizations if they're not sustained, and you need time and cultivation for these grassroots organizations to really grow and be able to be a movement for change. So these are both lessons I've taken with me to Burma, Go, and South Africa. So following the brutal repression, and Mohsen went to prison for 1 year, we then escaped the way we came, although not quite. So we ran away by horseback, although Lee here likes to say that we should call it donkey back, but it's horseback. Donkeys would be more cinematic, apparently, over the Kurdish mountains to Istanbul. And we left Jale and Mohsen behind as refugees in Istanbul because Nargis and I had been born in England, and at that time, that allowed us to get British passports. So we flew over to London, and there we were welcomed by my beloved uncle Masoud and his wife Ferishte, my auntie, and Jobis, who was 2 years old at that time, and Yusha, who was born on the day that we arrived. So on the 11th of August, 1984, she was born and we arrived. And really, the kindness they gave us, given they were a small family living in a small flat with a toddler and a newborn, is never to be forgotten. But it was amazing. But I do reflect daily that if we were escaping today, and not 4 decades ago, we too may be amongst those faceless people who drown in the demonized small boats off the coast of Britain, and it's always worth reflecting on that. So how does this all relate to my science and research? So I think each life is a story. It's a story of a journey. A scientist's journey is often more of a quest, a creative quest. And so I'm here, I have a collage of all the children that have listened to my stories over the years, my really beloved cousins, Jobis and Nusha, but Sana and Puno are not here, but they're in the US. And then my own children, my Luminu and Michka. And they have really listened and become part of the story that I will now tell you. So we come to chapter 2, Revolution and Sex. Sex is less, revolution more. So we fast forward to Gomble and Keyes College, Cambridge in the late 80s. Many friends here from Gomble and Keyes College in the late 80s and the rest of Cambridge in the late 80s. And I studied medicine and social and political sciences. Now, this was the era of Thatcher, and she fully understood the danger of social cohesion. She had very ideologically motivated policies which were designed to specifically undermine society and collective action in all its forms. I found lifelong friends who kept my critical instincts alive, and the reason why we have more demonstrations here is many other photos just had cigarettes and alcohol in them. It's not a photo yet, so you have to see a lot of demonstrations. But I was also intellectually stimulated and learned about structure and power. This is distilled in my dissertation on the Islamic Republic of Iran, but these lessons in power, solidarity, and collective action have really informed my science since. I think it's important to understand the structures with which we work when we're trying to tackle even infectious diseases. So it went too far. So I came with Médecins Sans Frontières to the northern Kachin state of Burma. This is one of the most beautiful places on planet. I really cannot imagine anywhere that was more beautiful. And some of the most wonderful people I know, including my husband Bomro, who I met there. But that beauty was really juxtaposed against the daily brutal violence of the Burmese military junta. It's a military junta who declared war on young people, basically. The young people had risen against them in the 80s in the universities, and their solution to that was close all universities and create a lost generation, particularly amongst the minorities. I also witnessed the impact of Orwellian newspeak, what you hear about in 1984. HIV had been designated a disease of the corrupt Western world and therefore could not exist in this beautiful paradise known as Myanmar, according to the military. So even though we knew that 9 out of 10 injection drug users were living with HIV, even though every young person that we saw in the hospitals had the clear stigmata of AIDS, we could not call it HIV or AIDS. I also witnessed how criminalizing sex work and injection drug use is a huge barrier to the simplest of all interventions, condoms and clean needles. If people were found with condoms or clean needles, they would go to prison, 10 years hard labor, which was absolute sort of guaranteed death, or if they were lucky, they'd get sent into that far right corner, a sort of re-education place, which still ended up in death. And so really depressing. But I also discovered the joy in the creative ways that we've found to overcome some of these structural barriers and deliver services even in this repressive context. This was my first foray into working with young peer educators that provided sexual health promotion, condom promotion. You can see them on the left, sort of showing how to use condoms, handing out leaflets that people read avidly in a context where there was no information. But we also set up the first sexual health clinic in Burma. This clinic on the right, called Tazin. Tazin means a white orchid, so it's a pure flower, a sign of sort of purity and cleanliness. And the idea was that this sexual health clinic was discreet, it was non-judgmental, it was light, it was friendly, and everybody could come in there and they could receive services. And through that clinic, we managed to see clandestine sex workers, injection drug users, jade miners, and many others at risk of HIV, discreetly and providing a full package of service. There are now 16 of these clinics throughout Burma. But I'll come back to this lesson, the importance of sex and sexual health to reach marginalized populations at greatest risk of HIV, but also other bloodborne viruses. And we do this in South Africa, and we'll come to that soon. Although I did my first randomized control trial on malaria in Burma, I actually fell in love with HIV and sexual health. And so I abandoned my plans to become a neurologist at that time and came back to the Morton Market Centre, which is just across the road from here and one of the best places to study genitourinary medicine in the world. And many people here have also studied alongside me. And I found many wonderful friends, and I'm going to really epitomized by Fiona Burns, Professor Fiona Burns, I should say, who's been my work partner for 24 years. Together, we did a master's in epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene. Together, we got our Wellcome Trust fellowships. Together, we did our PhDs. And we both had 3 children around the same time as each other and became professors around the same time as each other. So, but I'm most proud that we were the first NIHR GUM clinical lecturers. And we were also the first to job share and break this idea that part-time specialist registrars had to be supernumerary, because they sort of felt like it would be very difficult if one person wasn't available for the consultant to call and ask them questions. And I think we proved and showed that through a job share, we not only didn't compromise care, but everything was enhanced by our 2 brains, very different, complementary, and I'm hoping our 2 brains will do great things going forward. But anyway, I wanted to build on my learning from this Tazin clinic, the sexual health clinic that I was describing in Burma, to co-develop an HIV prevention with sex workers. And so I approached Francis Cowan, who at that time was still is, doing amazing work with sex workers in Zimbabwe and was a guru of sex workers. We had lots of plans. We wanted to go to Burma on the border with China. That didn't work. I wanted to go to Iran. That didn't work. And then one day, through serendipity, I was doing an on-call with Professor Maybe at the back there. And we were talking in front of the pneumocystis pneumonia X-ray, and he said, I hear you want to do some work with sex workers. Why don't you go to Goa? And so it was that I met my incredible mentors, Francis, David, and Vikram. So Francis taught me to be ambitious, but still maintain incredibly high quality research. Vikram showed me the application of epidemiology, going from describing to developing and evaluating. And David taught me to cultivate networks as the most important thing, because you really need to know the people who have the special tests that you need when you need it. So courtesy of the Wellcome Trust, which I will thank forever, I had 3 children, completed my PhD part-time on the beaches of Goa. But I had only arrived in Goa and set up a sex worker advisory group to support the process of this intervention development that I was discussing, when we heard that a High Court injunction was passed to close Baina Beach. And just as a sort of little side, sex work isn't actually illegal in Goa or in India. However, brothels are. And there was an incoming BJP government at that time. It wanted to consolidate its power base, and it wanted an anti-migrant, anti-Muslim sentiment to be used to consolidate its power base. And therefore, it used the excuse of brothels, because this area was also predominantly a slum with migrants living there, used that excuse to try and demolish this area. And so despite everything that we did, following a 6-month cordon, on the 14th of June 2004, they raided and demolished this area, made 8,000 people homeless, and a decade of HIV prevention came to an abrupt halt. But my sex worker advisory group really urged me to stay and said, please, what we need to do is really map what this means. What does criminalization, this ultimate structural violence of criminalization of sex work, what is the outcome, and explain what it means. So what did we find? I think using the language of our sex workers rather than my language, these 2 quotes really epitomize what happened. So 3 guys from Bombay had booked her for a night. The pilot had taken money for 1 full night plus a full day. When the girl wanted to leave, the clients refused to let her go and locked her up inside the lodge. Earlier, if we did not have enough money, someone would give us 10 to 20 rupees, and with which we could run our domestic life. But now, even if you ask, there is no one who can give you a single rupee. So these quotes really illustrate how in a new, unfamiliar setting, without the community support, sex workers were much less able to negotiate their safety. But importantly, without the kind of social safety net, the money that was in the community, they had no choice. And so once they were destitute and insecure, obviously health, particularly HIV prevention, becomes a very low priority. Now, state violence unleashed on the sex workers of Goa was in stark contrast with what was happening just north of the border in Karnataka. In Karnataka, an Navahan program funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation had collectivized 80,000 sex workers, and these collectivized sex workers were really able to be active, and they were engaged in collective actions which allowed them to better access social entitlements, reduce their experience of violence, both from their clients but also from police, and overall their sexually transmitted infection rates were coming down. This really contrasts with what we were seeing in the sex workers whose brothels had been demolished and who were dispersed, where risk was going up in terms of less condom use, and much higher prevalences of sexually transmitted infections amongst non-binary sex workers. So we enter chapter 3, and this is motherhood. And Michka was conceived during the demolition, so it was a terrible time from one point of view, but she brought so much hope and laughter, and she taught me how to delegate. I had to go and deliver her, and Sonali, who I think I saw coming in here, had to take over, and I realized that actually other people can do the job just as well as I can, and so that was really good. My Luminu were born on the eve of my failed Wellcome Trust intermediate fellowship submission, and they taught me to relish maternity leave and consider a plan B, which up until then I never had. And so with all 3, I found a love that I really couldn't imagine possible, and I still think is one of the most amazing things that happened to me. Meanwhile, Bomra's restaurant in Goa was becoming increasingly famous, a haunt to go and eat amazing food, but also spot celebrities. And so here we were, living between Goa and London. So this is just a collage of all the many, many friends that we had in Goa that we had fun with. A particular shout out really to Gowri, Naz, and Ricardo, who we spent a lot of time with in Goa, and then my family, my Iranian family in Germany. So that just sort of a moment to pause on the fun that we had with our friends, and more fun with friends in the UK, of which many are here, as I can see, and a lot are online. But again, really was a very fun time. Really strongly recommend taking maternity leave if you can, and paternity leave and any form of leave that is given. Then, Leah Nargis, my sister and brother-in-law, really was the driving force behind some of this fun and all the bubbles of fun that we had, and just a shout out to them. Unfortunately, though, motherhood also brings with it this obsession with security. And so having failed to secure funding for my randomized controlled trial, which at that time I think was pretty revolutionary, integrated community-based in mental health, HIV, and cardiovascular disease care and prevention, but no one would fund it. So I was really, really pleased when Richard and Graham, also here, offered me a secure role, well, suggested I could possibly apply for the secure role as a lecturer. And so I gave up Goa and came back to the UK and immersed myself in teaching. First, the Masters in HIV and Sexually Transmitted Infection, which I took over from John Richens, and then setting up a Masters in Population Health Sciences. But whilst leaving Goa was disappointing, I think this detour was an amazing experience for me, because Nigel Field and I have been able to implement a really exciting teaching program in our MSc in Applied Infectious Diseases Epidemiology, which if you have any children, please get them to do it at UCL, because it is really epitomizes this integration of infectious diseases into the socio-ecological framework. And what I would say, really integrating biosocial care and interdisciplinary science in order to tackle infectious diseases. And the reason I think it's important is if we look at COVID, the biomedical science was phenomenally powerful. The epidemiological science was also phenomenally powerful. But what we missed was the social and political interventions that would really implement them. And I think having that broader view is critical, and I'm really pleased in some ways that I came back and that we could set up this master's. So that brings us to biosocial care, chapter 5. Now, this chapter takes place in northern KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Here we are, Bomra, Michka, Milo, Manu and I at the beginning of this journey, and the picture on the right is Manu's interpretation of the amazing torrential elephant peeing, which is a big part of going on safari drives. Either elephants or, even better, hippos. But yeah. But actually, more seriously, the Africa Health Research Institute, and many of my colleagues are online, I know, and listening, at that time it was the Africa Centre, is in the northern KwaZulu-Natal of South Africa. It's a health and demographic surveillance site set up by Quobus Herps in a poor rural area with 85% youth unemployment and a high burden of HIV. It's an amazing infrastructure for doing research. Here you see a picture of Dean and Pillay, and he is currently having fun in the south of France, but he enticed me to South Africa by inviting me to a Hotspots workshop, where I had met Janet Seeley at the back there, a kindred spirit who really taught me how to listen to what people are saying, not just measure. And now Willem Hannekam, who's a current director, who's teaching me the importance of developing research strategy, implementing research strategy, and understanding research strategy, which I'm still not sure I do, but obviously it's very important. But when I started 7 years ago, HIV incidence amongst adolescents and young adults, aged 15 to 24, had remained high for a decade. The graph on the right really compares 2 time points. It's looking at 2006 to 2010, 2011 to 2015, in men and women aged 15 to 19 and 20 to 24. And what you need to think about is the dots and the spots are where we think the incidence is, and the lines around it are the lines around the, we assume that the real incidence is we're confident they're somewhere between those 2 lines. Now, if you just look at the 2024, the second one, you'll see that the HIV incidence amongst 20 to 24-year-old women was 8% per annum, ranging between 7 to 9%. And that had not changed in the decade. So this was a situation we arrived in. And so what we wanted to understand is why haven't effective biomedical preventions, at that time it was predominantly HIV treatment as prevention, why haven't they worked, and importantly, what is to be done? And we used the approach that I've just talked about, describe, with good epidemiology, but also good social science. Co-create interventions and then evaluate them. And because we had this demographic surveillance, where we know everything about everybody in the community, we could look at the population effect of those interventions. So just reminding you, because some of you aren't HIV people, what are the interventions that do work? As I said, we have the lovely, simple, easy and cheap to use lateral flow test that can be used everywhere, tests for HIV. We're very lucky for HIV, unlike other infectious diseases. This is a sensitive and specific test that can diagnose HIV in everywhere, and it's really cheap. Once you've tested, you can go into the cascade of care. If you're positive, we know the work done, elegant work done here by Alison Rogers, showed that people living with HIV on antiretroviral therapy suppress their virus, they cannot transmit it. Therefore, undetectable equals uninfectious. We also know that if you're negative and at risk, if you take a pill a day, in the case of men, the pill around sex, in the case of women, probably between 4 and 6 pills is enough, you won't catch HIV. You cannot acquire HIV. So those two tools are cheap and readily available. So how do we implement them? The first study I led at RE, in Africa Health Research Institute, was a Gates-funded DREAMS impact evaluation. And DREAMS was a PEPFAR-funded and really ambitious idea, trying to combine behavioral and structural interventions to try and really improve adolescent girls and young women's resilience to HIV. And we were part of the impact evaluation. In our area, Umkanya-Kudu, the uptake was really good. More than 80% received one component of this intervention. So you couldn't say the uptake wasn't good. But when we looked at its impact on HIV incidence, there was none. If you can see there, the naught, those lines, whether they're the overall or the younger or older women, all cross naught, so no effect. And this was disappointing. But when we looked a little bit more deeply, we realized although the HIV testing was decentralized, the biomedical interventions weren't. Antiretroviral therapy was still in the clinics, and PrEP was hardly to be seen. And so our first lesson is that we may need to deliver biomedical interventions in the same way we do the structural and biological interventions at a community level more widely. The next point that we found out is that poverty and youth unemployment are a huge challenge for young people. And one of the consequences of this poverty and lack of opportunity is that in our setting, 14% of young women reported selling sex. In this population-based sample, you'll see that does matter. So the blue bars are the young women who report selling sex, and the green bars are everybody else. And you can see the young women who sell sex have an HIV incidence of 8% compared to 2.5% in those that don't at a population level. So significantly more vulnerable to acquiring HIV. However, if you look at the purple bars, when we're looking at the PrEP kind of distribution within this community, the young women who sell sex did actually know their HIV status often, but they were not aware or on PrEP. So they weren't really receiving the interventions that would help them protect themselves against acquiring HIV. We also know from studies done by Ron Barnabas at Harvard in our setting that community-based care for HIV is very effective. So she compared starting people in the community, that's having a little mobile van in the community, testing HIV, starting antiretroviral therapy, with starting in a clinic, a good primary healthcare clinic, but in a clinic, or starting in a clinic and continuing in the community. And the community start and continue had the best virological suppression, particularly amongst men. So lesson 3 is that community-based care is safe and effective. We also conducted a series of studies with Rachel McKendry from iSense here, looking at HIV self-testing. So in HIV self-testing, you are taking a test and you are performing it and reading it and interpreting it yourself. That's what a self-test is. Now, we were looking at whether you could integrate this HIV self-testing with a digital pathway, with an app, with a telephone. And what we found is that for people, the HIV self-test has always been popular because they can do the test in the convenience and privacy of their home. But adding to it the ability to link digitally allowed it to have some safety, so they could connect with a clinic, they could connect with a nurse. And so this combination was popular. And so we added a layer to lesson 3, saying that decentralizing HIV care could include some innovations in diagnostics, but also innovations in digital support in some form or another. So lesson 1 to 3 culminated in our first randomized controlled trial of HIV self-testing in creating demand for PrEP as part of the STAR consortium, which is led by Liz and Francis here. So in 2019, we conducted the cluster randomized controlled trial comparing 2 different models of delivering HIV self-test. One was to give self-tests through incentivized no social networks, so people could give the self-test to their friends, to their friends, to their friends through the network. And the other was directly by a peer navigator who would deliver it to the person and talk about it with them. And that was compared with a peer navigator just delivering health promotion directly to people. So what we found, unfortunately, is that the HIV self-test did not create demand for PrEP. However, it did allow a lot of HIV tests to be distributed. 1 in 4 young people in the area received a HIV self-test. But what we did find is that peer navigators did mobilize demand for PrEP. 1 in 10 of the young people that were met by a peer navigator, either with an HIV self-test or just having a conversation, were able to link young people to HIV treatment or PrEP. And this compared to only 3 in 100 if it was distributed through the social networks. And we did a very nice social science piece of work to try and understand why this was the case. And what people said was very obvious. They said, we like getting the HIV self-test, we like to test ourselves, we like to know what our status is, but we don't want our friends to tell us about something like PrEP, which is a new thing. we like someone who's got a bit of training. They're the same age as me, that's like me, but they've got a bit of training and they know what they're talking about. It's a new product, so we like to get that from them. So this was lesson number 4. There aren't any magic products. There's no magic product that's going to make community-based care easy. There's no magic product for testing. What you're going to need is to integrate it within the broader context of your wherever you're working, and do it with people that people trust. Who do they need? Who do they get their information from? Who is going to help them get care? Or as Janet would say, to test their candidacy for care. So our social science teams have been telling us, and policymakers, everybody have been telling us that families are really concerned, young people are very concerned about their sexual and reproductive health. They're worried about their fertility. They're worried about poor birth outcomes. They're worried about ectopic pregnancies. These are their worries. And everybody was saying, don't worry about STIs. But we did look at STIs, and we found that there was an extremely high prevalence at a population level of sexually transmitted infections. That is 1 in 3 young people, young women, and 1 in 5 young men have either gonorrhea, chlamydia, or trichomonas, which are treatable, curable STIs at a population. This is randomly selected from the population. And worse than that, they're majority asymptomatic, so they wouldn't access services through a primary healthcare clinic. Even more worrying, I think, is the chlamydia, where you see 15 to 19-year-old girls and 20 to 24-year-old men have very high chlamydia rates, about 1 in 4. So, 5th lesson was there is a very high burden of unmet sexual health need. So this led to my next randomized control trial, and the first globally to show that STI testing, sexually transmitted infection testing, and sexual health increases demand for risk-differentiated HIV prevention amongst youth, including PrEP. So we found that those randomized to home-based STI self-sampling, so that's vaginal swabs for women, urine for men, and a sexual health intervention, so come to the clinic and get a sexual health intervention, had a 60% higher odds of linking to care. And if they had peer support as well, they had a 50% higher odds of staying in care. So this is the lesson 6, which is integrating HIV services within sexual health services, a little bit like what I talked about in Tazin, in Burma, a decade before. This is an effective way to create demand for HIV prevention amongst most vulnerable and at-risk young people. Disappointingly, we hadn't found an effect of the peer support to the degree we wanted to, and this was partly an effect of COVID because it went virtual, and most of the young people would have preferred to have a face-to-face with their peer before they went virtual. But the other important thing that we found in our social science process evaluation was that although the sexual health intervention was very popular, lots of the peers were very concerned that they couldn't do anything about the social needs that the young people had. And there was a very large unmet social need. I've just talked about 85% unemployment, so you can imagine that. So lesson 7 was the need to integrate sexual health with a social intervention. So we do co-creation, and that is with our peers and youth. We critically reflected on all these lessons I just described to you. And what was called Thetha Nami, which is talk to me as a peer support intervention, evolved into Thetha Nami, ngithethe, nawe, which means let's talk as a group. And what that really is, that we've got trained area-based peer navigators who are aged 18 to 30. They are selected by their municipal and traditional leadership, so they live in their areas, and they are supported by an experienced supervisor, and also they have a social worker and nurse they can access. And there's a mobile sexual health clinic that comes to each of their areas once a month, a place designated for them to come. And what they do is they provide one-to-one peer support, where they have a conversation with a young person and then they define what that young person's need is. They categorize that need, is it high, medium, or low? And they send that as an action plan to their supervisors and to the review panel of a social worker and a nurse. And this sort of electronic connection that they have in the community with the supervisory panel means that they feel that they have the ability to support young people in the community and help them have the agency to navigate services. They also are working much harder to try and support this solidarity, bonding, and collective identity through setting up youth groups and setting up safe spaces. And ultimately, they've been mobilizing, they've looked at their resources in their communities. What is the health resources? What are the social resources? And by mapping that, identifying adults who can help them, link them into services, that combination, we hope, as it matures, can support collective action. So as I said, this is a community-based intervention, so we need to see what the community-based effect is. And so we're testing this in a cluster randomized controlled trial, where you randomize clusters to receive intervention or not receive intervention, and look at the outcome of whether people's HIV incidence goes down, or if they are HIV positive, they're living with HIV, they get onto treatment sooner. So I'm going to tell a story to try and illustrate how this works. So imagine a girl, Nondamiso, she's 19 years old, her father's died, and her mother's working in Johannesburg, and she was living in her grandparents' household, and the uncle was a bit abusive, a bit of an alcoholic. And so as soon as she finishes high school, she leaves her rural household and says, I'm going to come to the town to find some work. Now, the town that she's come to is a small roadside town of KwaZulu-Natal. And obviously, we just talked about 85% youth unemployment. She doesn't find any work. But she meets a 26-year-old taxi driver. He's kind to her. He gives her gifts. He gives her money. He takes her around. And so she feels obliged to have condomless sex with him. She isn't identified as a sex worker. She doesn't access the sex worker programs because she doesn't see this as sex work. But Zonke, who's a trained Thetha Nami peer navigator, is living in KwaZulu-Natal, has, as I said, this sort of conversation, this simple conversation with her, health promotion conversation. And through the conversation, she realizes that she's actually really lonely. She's engaged in sex primarily for company and a bit of material support. And so she helps her get her voter ID so she can claim her social grants. She invites her to the youth group so she can meet other young people. She talks to her about sexual health and HIV, and she takes her to the mobile clinic where she starts contraception and she starts her PrEP. So you can see this illustrates this sort of biosocial package in practice, how it helps a young person navigate the different risks they may have. And it's pretty cheap because these are like community caregivers. So it's task shifting to a kind of group of sort of a cadre of staff that don't need a huge amount of training. Now, I said we were going to test this in a cluster randomized controlled trial. So that's the area that we're working in. And the blue, there's sort of 40 clusters that we divided into, and the blue clusters are the clusters that receive this intervention early, and the yellow clusters will receive it after a year. And at baseline, as you can see, prevalence of HIV was high, but also there was a high proportion of young men and women who were not on HIV treatment and were not suppressed. And this is in a context where older men and women are all on HIV treatment and suppressed. So there is a need to access young people. And as you can see, PrEP was very barely used. So what have we seen in the first period? In the first period of this trial, peer navigators reached 3/4 of the young people in their areas, and half of those were men. So people always say you can't reach men. They did reach men. And then we did, as I said, they had this conversation and they did this classification, and about 20% of the ones that they saw they felt were high or medium need, and they sent them to the clinic. Now, normally, if we went into our setting and we just put our hand into our setting and plucked any young person out, there'd be a 16% of them would either require HIV treatment or would be benefiting from PrEP. But if you look at the young people that came to the clinic in the blue, orange, and green pieces of the pie, 60% of the young people that the peers are sending to the clinic are eligible for either HIV treatment or PrEP. So they are identifying and mobilizing a particularly vulnerable and high-need group of young people to come to the clinic. So our 8th lesson is that peer-led need assessment and sexual health services are effective in creating PrEP and ART demand in those who need it. But what happens once they start? That's a little bit more depressing. So the green, if you look at the green, that's everyone. The blue is the boys and the red is the girls. So the green, we see that lots of people are eligible for PrEP. Only 60% of them start. Those that start, only 20% continue. And the main reason they don't, lesson 9, is they do not like a tablet a day. It's a rattling, antiretrovirals, there's a social censure, being outed as sexually active if you're found with the tablets. The tablets are associated with the stigma of HIV. And so there is a challenge to, even in this context, with this lovely intervention of actually people starting and staying on PrEP. But there is hope. There will be hope if I get to the next slide. But there is potential hope because there is this amazing injectable, long-acting cabotegravir, which was shown in a randomized controlled trial to be 90%, reduce HIV incidence by 90% compared to oral PrEP in women, and that was almost entirely driven by adherence. However, how will this work in the real world? Especially oral PrEP is cheap as chips. It really is a very cheap, very safe drug that you can just throw out there and nothing's going to happen. This is not going to be cheap, even at a not-for-profit price tag that they're talking about is going to be more expensive. So our country's going to put it into their central drug list. even if the price comes down, it needs to be delivered by a nurse. It's an injectable. It needs a different infrastructure. And also, it's every 2 months. There are lots of complications, so we do need to know how it works in real world. So we, again, have all those clusters, remember? We have 40 clusters. We now re-randomize the clusters for 20 to receive choice. And the choice that they have is either the injectable or this vaginal ring that doesn't work very much, but it's out there, or oral PrEP. But they also get a choice of PEP in the pocket. So this is a pot of 28 days of HIV treatment that you can take immediately after sex with HIV testing, with condoms, with lubrication, so that if people don't want PrEP now, they don't know if they're going to have sex, they don't have that much sex, they can take this and take it home with them. And this we will compare with just oral PrEP alone, and again look at population uptake and retention. So what happens at a population level if you offer this choice? Is it worth it? So hot off the press, very early data, the first month, what we find is both men and women, a higher proportion are starting when we're giving them choice than before we gave them choice. Remember, it was only 60%, now a much higher portion are starting. And not everyone starts injectable. 75% did start the injectable, and they like it, but 25% chose to not start the injectable. They're on oral PrEP, but also, of those, a third of the ones that chose the oral option chose PEP in the pocket. They like that, they're going to take that home. And this is obviously early days. We don't know what the retention is going to be, we don't know what the impact is going to be, but a sense that, choice, particularly post-exposure prophylaxis, has some place in this. So, I hope I've shown you the community-based tailored HIV prevention that meets social health needs, reaches young men and women at greatest need, and choice may improve uptake and retention. And this model of biosocial care is both simple and sustainable. It's popular with the Department of Health. It's because it reduces teenage pregnancies. It's popular with the Department of Social Science, Social Welfare, because they really care about youth development. And it's popular with the traditional leadership and the municipal leadership because it gives employment to young people in their communities. So everybody likes it. And we're hoping that choice may improve uptake and retention. But let's talk about justice in health. So I've alluded to how social justice informs good science. Now I want to speak about how it also informs the way we do global health. Vikram Patel and Frances Cowan were my early inspiration in this globally equitable models of research, and this was then further strengthened by Janet Seeley and then consolidated through Willem, his passion to make RE a South African institute. And I've been hugely privileged to have been appointed to the RE Executive Committee, here pictured on the right, as their Director of Implementation Science, one of the 4 directors of science to deliver our vision, which is health and well-being of under-resourced populations. And that's done together with the faculty on the left. But through the process of developing RE strategy and securing the Wellcome Trust Strategic Award, I've really been helped by Pinky, our COO, and Willem to really critically engage by what is meant to do global health research through the lens of justice, what it means to move the locus of power to the south. Because truly equitable partnerships are difficult. It requires moving resources and research leadership, not just the implementation to the global south. It also means tackling questions around rightful ownership of the intellectual property and the knowledge that arises from the research. Who owns that knowledge? The researchers in the global south, the people of the global south. And this practical decolonization will be challenging because resources are much, much smaller. Both institutions of the north and institutions of the south are going to be competing over a smaller pot of money. And so I think really these are difficult questions, and it's not easy just to have a sort of simple answer for them, and they're questions we have to have. And so I really thank my colleagues at RE for making me constantly evolve my thinking around what just and equitable partnerships look like and what it's needed to sustain them. Tumi Ndunga taught me one critical aspect of it is that no decolonization of health and science can happen without training the next generation of African scientists. And so I'm proud to have been really mentoring this cohort of amazing PhDs and postdocs and junior faculty. They're not only brilliant, but truly embody team science. I'm proud of everyone here, but I'm going to call out a few. Natsai Chimbindi, who following her work on my early studies, received a Wellcome Trust Fellowship to look at school-based interventions. Tembi Zuma, who with the help of Janet has done all the social sciences studies that I shared, and will be hopefully getting a fellowship to develop much needed family-based interventions. I talked about the importance of family. And Yana, who successfully received the K Award to look at models of STI care. I talked about the issues around STIs. And always Guy Hurling, who's not only kind of a social network guru, but he keeps me mathematically grounded when I go off on a tangent. Large implementing trials also need a huge amount of organization, especially when we have to conduct them with the rigor of a clinical trial, which we increasingly do. And so going clockwise from this triangle, really the hugest thank you is the two with the triangle, Karina and Nonhlankla, who manage these huge studies and look after hundreds of teams. Then there's Demakatsu, who's not only a scientist and a fellow director, but she is a whiz at clinical trial solution problem solving and operationalizing complicated clinical trials. Anita and the social science team, Tandeka, who keeps the entire clinical side of ARIA afloat, Yako, who is a wizard at data solutions, and Sangeeta and Kana, my PAs, I think, without which I actually wouldn't function, as I think they know. And then Teresa runs the laboratories, and Sabelo helps me balance the books. And the final chapter 6, inspiration. Now, over 5,000 years ago, my ancestors in Mesopotamia wrote the first written concept of freedom, of reference to freedom, on a cuneiform tablet, amagi. Amagi means returning to mother. This was a reference to freedom from debt bondage, and we do owe a huge debt to our ancestors to keep that flame of freedom, Azadi in Farsi, alive, and epitomized by the slogan that many of you have heard, woman, life, freedom, Zan Zindagi Azadi. I really, really hope that we take this back. I've also been blessed to be part of some amazing consortiums, all of which were led by brilliant women. When I was doing this, I hadn't quite clicked, but it was the case. Amethyst, led by Frances Cowan, Star, led by Liz and Frances, Liz Corbett and Frances Cowan, iSense, led by Rachel McKendry, Mobile Men, led by Julie Fox, and the implementation group in South Africa that are trying to work out how to implement long-acting CAB, led by Hasina Subedar. I've also had an amazing mentorship team, and you've seen many of these phases in the previous chapters, so I'm not going to go back to them, but I want to highlight some extra ones here. My mother, Jale, with her friends, Azar, who taught me feminism, Iranian style. Mohsen and Akbar, who taught me critical thinking. Asra, who taught me loyalty and work ethic, but helped me get the Yale Fellowship that led me to the wonderful Jerry Friedland, who was one of the first people who showed me how biosocial and patient-centered care would work in the late 90s in the US. Pam and Claudia, who teach me rigor in science and periodically scrutinize my CV to make sure I can stop things, and Kathy and Andrew, who teach me about complex trials, which they are still ongoing. And then a collage of my friends. Again, many of you are here. Thank you, Omine, for being my hamdam. Payvand, Nargis, Kylie, Hotif, Afar for all the laughter, Lee, Dan and Jackie for music and words, Julia for keeping me traveling all those years and good restaurants early on, and then Penny for rescuing me on the first day of bewilderment at Keys, Jane, Dave and Ian for cocooning me during medical school, which wasn't the easiest time, and wonderful book club, Fiona, Kalu, Sanjay, Anna, Alison, Eleni and Tony for keeping me reading, and Katie, Naomi, Nazrin, Shuan, Emma, Julia, and Julie, who keep questioning why, and Nikki, who I miss so much, Marieza, who couldn't be with us today on this meeting, in this. An army of helpers. So behind every professor that you see in front of you who's a female, there has been an army of helpers. And this is my army of helpers. This army of women and some men who supported me and loved my children, especially Janoy, who's in Delhi, and Natalia, who's in Spain, and Chiara, who I think I saw come in. So yes, and Chiara did the beautiful sketch in the wonderful. As universities, scholarship and truth come under attack and are literally bombed as we speak, my final plea is for a wholehearted defense of academic freedom and scholarship. I was fortunate to be born into a family that values scholarship and knowledge. My grandmother in the middle was one of the first women to go to university, and my grandfather on the right was an engineer. They were always there cheering me on, dropping me off to study. This gave me, a refugee at a state comprehensive, the confidence to apply for medicine to King's College, Cambridge. And so I hope that you, particularly the young ones in this audience, you take up the baton, embrace knowledge, study whatever you love. The arts, the sciences, the creatives, it doesn't matter. Study what you love and question everything. And finally, I hope I've convinced you that social justice and equity, tackling power structures alongside sexual rights, are integral to HIV resilience. Interdisciplinary science, especially one that's inclusive and equitable, is critical to delivering biosocial solutions, and that freedom underpins everything. You should accept all the love and support you are given. That's the only way you'll succeed, particularly if you're women, and give some back as you grow up. And then thank you to my beloved family, many who are here listening. Some will be online in Australia, America, Iran, and all of you for listening to me talk about myself.
Can I introduce my friend and colleague, Francis Cohen, who's Professor of Global Health at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, and who was actually here for many, many years before moving up to Liverpool.
So, how to follow that? So my job is to make Maryam sound likeable, engaging, someone you'd like to know, and I don't need to do that, do I? So I'm going to sit down again. Maryam sent me her talk, I think it was late last week, and she said, have I done too much? And I said, well, the only thing you have to be careful with, got a lot of photos there, you're going to have to stay on script. And she said, yes, I'll remember that, I'm going to stay on script. Just to let you know, she hasn't stayed on script. She's said a lot more. So not only has she given her own talk, but she's actually given all that I was planning to say. So, there you go. So I am going to talk, hang on, about what a wonderful woman Maryam is, and you know that already, so this is an easy sell. It's very nice to be here to celebrate Maryam's promotion to being a full professor. It's also great to be back at UCL, which I left a while ago now. I'm not going to try and repeat what Maryam said, although I will repeat some of it, I think, because, as I said, she went off script. I just thought I would go in a little bit more depth where I still can on some of the things I've learnt about Maryam and her family over the years. So, over the years, I've heard about the escape story from Iran many times. Often at the end of the evening, often over a glass of wine, and different things get included or omitted depending on how it came up, who's there, what the point of the story is going to be, probably also how much wine has already been drunk. But one of my favourite images that almost always comes up is of Maryam's mother, Jola, crossing the border from the Islamic Republic of Iran into Turkey. And apparently when she got to the village on the other side, she threw off her hijab and ordered a beer. And it was the first commercially made, not made in secret in a cellar beer that she'd been able to drink for a few years. And it's a lovely image of delight at the small things, and I don't mean to say throwing off your hijab is a small thing, but delight at the small pleasures in life. So, first time I met Maryam. So I met Maryam's father before I met Maryam. I had the good fortune to be trained in GE medicine by Mosen when I first set out.
We were registrars together.
No, you were a senior registrar. I was So I'd already worked with Mosen for a couple of years. A few years later, there I am, sat at UCL in my STI clinic, and this beautiful, dynamic young woman comes in with the name Shahmanesh on her coat. So I said, oh, you must be Mosen's daughter. Yes, she was pretty frosty, I have to say. And so I'm going off script now because you've told my stories. And she was pretty frosty and let me know pretty quickly that she'd just come back from doing a neurology fellowship at Yale, and that she certainly wasn't interested in a career in GU medicine. And she was going to be a neurologist. For those of you who aren't medical here, I don't think there's probably that many of you who don't know a bit about medicine, but neurologist is what the very brainy doctors do, and GU medicine is a bit less, perhaps less highbrow. And she was definitely going to be doing neurology. But as Maryam's already so nicely described, she went off to Myanmar with MSF to do a trial in malaria treatment and ended up setting up an STI clinic, got completely hooked by the importance of sexual and reproductive health, and came back to UCL to train in GU medicine. So that was all good. She arrived there just about the time I left to go to Zimbabwe, actually, but she, as she's already mentioned, she wanted to do a Wellcome Trust fellowship in clinical epidemiology, and she wanted to work with sex workers. And so she asked me if I would sponsor her to do her fellowship. She looked around for places to study sex work in partnership with sex workers. She thought about the Myanmar-China border, so she wrote a proposal about that and we worked on that. Then she thought about Iran. I was excited by that because I'd been there when I was a young girl. And then David Mabey and Vikram Patel suggested Goa. And can I just tell you, being a PhD supervisor of somebody who's based in Goa is possibly the best gig. So, Maryam's already shown you this slide, or this is one actually I took from a presentation she did at a conference 15 years ago, 20 years ago. But Goa is a small state on the west coast of India, but because it has a large tourist population who are served by seasonal migrants, it's got mines, it's got a shipping industry, it's got lots and lots of truckers coming through every year. It was really thought to be particularly important in terms of what was seen to be an early HIV epidemic about to burgeon into a generalised epidemic in India. And it was really thought that even though it was such a small size, it was going to have quite a lot of significance. And, it was all of these things coming together meant, as Maryam's already mentioned, that there was a very vibrant sex trade there. The migrants were often bringing with them injecting drug use from the northern areas. It was one of the few parts of India where alcohol was freely available, and this created a kind of perfect storm of need among the sex workers. Sorry, I'm not. So we were working there. As I said, it was a very good gig to be a PhD student supervisor there. I got to go out every year and work with Maryam. And I worked with her team in Bina, which we saw being demolished. And I worked with her team in the Sangath offices, which were very hot, much hotter than this, for very long hours. And that was absolutely great. But we also spent quite a lot of time at the beach. I have realised I don't take a lot of photos, so forgive me. We spent a lot of time at the beach, drinking coffee, eating fish curry rice, while overlooking the Indian Ocean and discussing the wording of questionnaires, papers for inclusion in her systematic reviews, how she might change her research questions now the place she was planning to recruit her sample had been demolished and the population dispersed. And I was also there, and Maryam's already mentioned Bomra's restaurant. I was there right at the beginning. Maryam was giving lots of advice from the sidelines, as I'm sure you can imagine. But Bomra has set up this absolutely fantabulous restaurant, which serves possibly the most delicious food on the planet. And I say that having tasted quite a lot of delicious food from all over the place, but it really is extraordinary. And I don't just say this today, I always say this, don't I? And in 2023, it was ranked second best restaurant in all of India by Condé Nast, which is a pretty great achievement. I did look up to see if Bomber had a Michelin star or anything like that, but the Michelin people don't have a guide for India, so if they did, I'm sure he would have one. So if you go to Goa, and I think going to Bomra's is actually a reason in itself to go, then please don't miss his restaurant. So, many people would have given up their PhD when this happened. Maryam was going to do a house-to-house survey of sex workers in this area, and you can see there's not a house left standing. First, Maryam's team, she missed this when she was talking, but first Maryam's team provided support to the sex workers who had been displaced, and then they set about trying to trace all those sex workers who were still living in Goa, because a lot of them had been widely dispersed. It was hard to do, they were very hidden, they were very frightened. And she was able to show that their access to HIV services and sexual and reproductive health was much worse, and that they had very high rates of poor mental health. She actually published the first paper, I think, that I've seen on the mental health of sex workers globally. But I think even more importantly is Maryam publicised to an international audience what had happened there and added her voice to the discourse around rights and inclusion, which is now central to sex work programming all over the world. So she was one of the very early voices that really made that become the discourse it is today. And by any standards, her doomed project became a great success. And even at that stage in her career, so, you know, she's shown pictures of the Africans she's mentoring now in Southern Africa, but even at that very early stage in her career, she was supporting researchers to work with her to write papers, go to conferences. Dr. Sonali Weil is at the back, who was her senior researcher in Goa. And that's a tradition that she's kept on going forward. She didn't get the idea from Tumbi, she got it from herself. So, Maryam has presented her transition back to the UK very positively, but I remember it as quite a difficult time for her. Being dislocated from her husband, being dislocated from the work she was passionate about. Obviously the twins made a huge difference, but it was definitely a difficult time, and I think she was pretty despairing about ever being able to work internationally again. And then she got this opportunity through Dean and Pillay to go to the Africa Health Research Institute at KZN. And as you've heard, Maryam has established really a very, very strong implementation science unit there. The Africa Centre at the time she went was known for measuring lots of things and doing not a lot about any of the problems that were going on there. So they used to measure the incidence stayed very high. Look, it's high again and again. But they weren't actually at the time able to intervene to really try and change things. I'm getting into trouble here. He's my ex-head of department. But Maryam has brought to the Africa Health Research Institute a real lens of doing implementation work that counts and trying to change things so that you don't just measure, but you do something about what you find. So I'm just going to circle back to where I started, to the escape story, and Maryam has already referred to this already, but I think it's worth going back to, is every time Maryam's talking about the escape from Iran story, she always says that Jola and Mohsen were being persuaded by friends and family that they shouldn't come to the UK. they should go to Canada and the US. And that was because even back then, it was much easier to get leave to remain in Canada or the US. And that even though Nagas and Maryam had British passports, or the right to British passports, it wasn't guaranteed that Merzen and Jola would be able to do that. And as Maryam says, I always think when the story is being told, what happens if the Shahmaneshes were leaving now? And would they get here? And how would the family be treated when they arrive? And it's pretty depressing, the thought, isn't it? So, back to Maryam. This is to you. Here's to you. We've done that a few times. You're an extraordinary woman who's having a great impact on the world, on your students, on the researchers and colleagues you work with, and with the communities you seek to serve. You're supported by a truly wonderful family who you also support, I know. And there are some of the family here I haven't met, but I've heard all about you. And can I say, most of it's good. Not all, but most of it is good. May you continue to work to make the world a better place, and may the world bend to your not inconsiderable will, and let that happen.